So I want you to imagine a teenager just sitting perfectly still at the family dinner table.
Right.
They're eating their food, they're saying please and thank you, keeping their elbows off the table, just causing absolutely zero trouble.
The picture of a perfect kid.
Exactly. To their parents sitting right across from them, they look like a perfectly behaved, totally well-adjusted kid who's just quietly enjoying a Tuesday night meal.
Yeah, but that's just the surface level.
Right, because to a clinical developmental psychologist, that same child might actually be in the middle of a high-stakes biological survival sequence.
Oh, absolutely. It's intense.
Underneath that quiet exterior, their amygdala is just firing. Their autonomic nervous system is flooding their bloodstream with cortisol, and their heart rate is carefully calibrating to microscopic shifts in their father's tone of voice, or even just a slight tightening of their mother's jaw.
It's all about threat detection.
Right. You probably think of your living room or your dining room as just the place where the TV lives or, where you eat takeout. But today, we are completely rethinking the architecture of your home.
We really have to. We spend so much of our lives within these four walls that we develop this kind of, well, environmental blindness.
Environmental blindness. I like that.
Yeah, we literally stop seeing the space as an active participant in our psychological development. But the reality is that the physical geometry of a room, when you combine it with the ambient emotional tension held inside it,
Right.
it actually functions as a highly complex behavioral conditioning matrix.
Which is wild to think about. So welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to explore exactly how the physical and emotional layout of a living room serves as the ultimate psychological infrastructure for a child's development.
And frankly, it's for anyone attempting to coexist in a shared domestic space.
Good point, yeah. We are working from a deeply fascinating stack of sources today. They kind of sit at the intersection of developmental psychology, clinical family systems theory, and environmental architecture.
Which is a really unique overlap.
It is. We're essentially attempting to map out the nonverbal ecology of the home. Okay, let's unpack this. Because the journey we are taking through these sources today, it requires a complete reframing of how we understand domestic life.
We really have to peel back those superficial layers. I mean, we're looking past the furniture choices or, the paint colors and the square footage.
Right, the stuff you'd see on HGTV.
Exactly. We're examining the invisible forces that bounce off those walls. What's fascinating here is that we're analyzing things like the acoustic dynamics of household noise and the actual biological impact of ambient stress on the human digestive tract.
Which blew my mind when I read it.
It's incredible. And we'll look at the structural layouts that either foster severe withdrawal in kids or, on the flip side, encourage profound psychological resilience.
Right. So we're going to start by venturing into the hidden, surprisingly dark psychological weight of the child's bedroom.
A place we usually misunderstand entirely.
Totally. And from there, we'll move out into the intense, kind of maladaptive survival dynamics of a toxic living room. Then we'll drill all the way down into the literal biological mechanisms of how family dinners physically alter a child's nervous system.
The hard science of it all.
Yeah, and finally, we'll look at the actual architectural blueprints for engineering a psychologically safe home.
So it really requires us to view the home not just as a collection of rooms, but as this closed ecosystem of emotional and biological regulation.
Right. So let's start by dismantling a deeply ingrained cultural assumption. If I say a teenager's bedroom, the immediate cultural trope that springs to mind is like the fortress of solitude.
Oh, absolutely. The kids slamming the door, blasting music, putting up posters.
Exactly. We treat that space as their ultimate relaxing safe haven. Like it's their sanctuary away from the exhausting demands of their annoying parents.
Yeah, that is the universally accepted stereotype.
Yeah.
We just assume that because the child has retreated to a space that they control, they're inherently at peace, engaging in leisure or simply unwinding.
But the clinical sources we're analyzing paint a remarkably different picture.
Very different.
According to the developmental psychology literature, a child's bedroom is actually a very heavy, sometimes incredibly dark place of intense, unyielding rumination.
It is rarely a relaxing retreat.
Right. It's functioning much more like a high-pressure psychological processing lab.
That's a great way to put it. The clinical consensus shows us that when a child or an adolescent is alone in their room, they are not simply turning off their brains.
They're not just chilling.
No, not at all. They are actively engaged in the theater of profound internal conflict. The developmental load they carry at that age is just staggering. And the bedroom is the primary site where that load is unpacked and examined.
And the text details the specific categories of this cognitive load, and honestly, it reads like an existential crisis checklist.
It really does.
I mean, first, they're wrestling with the consolidation of their core identity, which alone is exhausting. But on top of that, they're navigating complex peer hierarchies.
And we aren't just talking about simple playground dynamics.
Right, no. We are talking about the intricate, constantly shifting sociometric status of their peer group. It's the absolute mental gymnastics of calculating social capital, romantic viability, and just their precarious standing in the social food chain.
Plus, they're terrified about their future. Their academic aptitude, their potential socioeconomic status, their eventual independence.
A lot.
It's a massive burden.
Yeah.
And crucially, the research emphasizes that they're intensely processing family problems.
Yes, this part was huge.
We operate under this protective illusion that children are somehow oblivious to adult complexities. But the data shows they are incredibly sensitive, highly attuned barometers of family tension.
They pick up on everything.
Everything. They are hyper-aware of parental marital discord or underlying financial stress or even unspoken health anxieties.
And the sources make a point here that I found deeply sobering. They describe children as possessing this fierce, almost heartbreaking devotion to the family unit.
It's a really powerful biological drive.
Yeah, and they operate with this silent, agonizing calculus where they're often willing to suppress their own developmental needs or sacrifice their own autonomy or just bury their own happiness just to keep the family intact.
Or just to avoid being an additional burden on their parents.
Right. And I suspect anyone listening can rewind to their own adolescence and locate that exact feeling, that quiet negotiation in the dark where you think, if I don't ask for help with this problem, maybe my parents won't have another argument about money tonight.
Exactly. And that internal negotiation is precisely what makes the bedroom such a dense environment. The bedroom is where that heavy calculus occurs.
So it's not a sanctuary at all?
No, it is the designated spatial container for bearing the weight of their own biological and social development, which is then compounded by the weight of their family's structural stability. It's a space of significant cognitive labor.
Okay, so the bedroom is essentially a pressure cooker of adolescent development. But I want to pause here and challenge the text's framing a bit.
Okay, go ahead.
Because my initial instinct, and probably the instinct of a lot of parents listening, is to view that kind of intense isolation as a major red flag.
Sure, that makes sense.
Right, like if a child is barricaded in their room, endlessly obsessing over their existential dread and their parents' unspoken financial problems, wouldn't a clinical psychologist look at that and say, this is a depressive symptom, this is a sign of a failing environment?
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah, shouldn't a well-adjusted kid be out in the world unbothered by these heavy adult burdens?
Well, what's fascinating here is that we have to consider the inverse scenario.
Okay.
The clinical framework presented in our sources actually suggests the exact opposite conclusion. The capacity for a child to retreat to their room and focus intensely on their own internal conflicts, their identity, their future, their social anxieties, is paradoxical proof of a fundamentally secure baseline environment.
Wait, really? I see the logic, but walk me through the mechanics of that. How does agonizing over your future equal a secure environment?
It traces back to the core principles of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but applied specifically to the microenvironment of the family system.
Okay.
Think about it. If a child's fundamental safety is in active jeopardy, if the household is characterized by unpredictable violence, severe neglect, or active explosive trauma.
Right, a truly dangerous environment.
Exactly. In that scenario, the child's nervous system remains locked in a state of hypervigilant external monitoring. They literally do not have the biological or cognitive luxury to sit in their room and ponder the nuances of their future career or the complexities of their personal identity.
Oh, wow. Because they're purely scanning the perimeter for immediate threats.
Precisely. The fact that their brain allows them to sit in the dark and ruminate on higher-order developmental questions means the perimeter of the home feels secure enough to permit that inward focus.
That is wild. That reframes the entire concept of teenage angst.
It does.
You can only worry about your philosophy, homework, or your social standing if your nervous system knows it doesn't have to listen for footsteps in the hallway. The rumination is basically a privilege of safety.
It is an evolutionary luxury. However, this brings us to the crucial spatial pivot in the sources.
Right, because of all this pressure.
Exactly. Because a bedroom is so heavily utilized for this dense, demanding internal work, the psychological ecosystem of the house requires a counterbalance.
The child absolutely requires a release valve,
They do.
which means the living room has to carry a completely different psychological function.
The living room must function as the unconditional shelter. If the bedroom is the laboratory where they deconstruct their anxieties, the living room must be the refuge where they are not required to process anything.
It has to be neutral territory.
Yes, it cannot be an environment that introduces new external threats because their cognitive load is already at maximum capacity from the bedroom.
Okay, so if the living room fails to be that shelter, the entire ecosystem collapses.
Completely collapses.
Which pulls us right into a deeply intense segment of our sources. What happens when the living room, instead of being a refuge, becomes a high-stakes tactical environment?
This is where things get really difficult.
The text provides this very vivid clinical case study drawn from the author's own childhood observations, and it perfectly illustrates the silent, devastating mechanics of a toxic domestic space.
It serves as an absolute masterclass in understanding the nonverbal transmission of pathology within a family system.
So let's reconstruct the architecture of this specific living room scenario. The author describes a typical evening where the father brings the entirety of his corporate work stress into the home.
Which is pretty common, unfortunately.
Right. And the text describes the air in the room as tense, prickling. It's not that he's screaming or throwing things, it's just this ambient, suffocating tension.
The silence is left.
Exactly. And in response to this heavy atmosphere, the mother engages in this maladaptive overcompensation. She's frantically trying to lighten the mood, forcing an artificial cheerfulness into a deeply uncomfortable space, attempting to manage the father's emotional state through sheer willpower.
And positioned directly in the crossfire of these competing emotional frequencies is the child.
Right. So for this child, sitting down to family dinner has nothing to do with nourishment. It is a grueling, exhausting performance.
It takes everything they have.
It requires immense somatic and cognitive energy just to occupy a chair at that table. But the most revealing detail in this clinical anecdote happens hours later.
Yes, the late-night realization.
The child has retreated to the heavy ruminative space of their bedroom, and late at night, through the drywall, they hear their parents in the master bedroom watching a television program and laughing together.
The father's ambient stress has finally dissipated, notably in the absence of the child.
And this creates a profound cognitive distortion. The child's brain synthesizes the data like this. Dinner was a suffocating nightmare of tension while I was there. Now I am gone and they are joyful.
A very dangerous conclusion to draw.
The inevitable internalized conclusion is, my presence is the variable that causes the tension. They are happier and the system is more stable when I am isolated.
And this is where we introduce a foundational concept from clinical family systems theory, originally formulated by the anthropologist and systems theorist Gregory Bateson in the 1950s.
Okay, tell us about Bateson.
Bateson was studying the communication patterns that lead to severe psychological fragmentation, and he identified the precise trap this child is caught in. It is called the double bind.
The double bind. Rather than just asking for a textbook definition, let's actually look at how it structurally traps the child at that dinner table.
Let's do it.
Because if I'm looking at the child's options in that prickling, tense room, they seem to only have two paths, and both of them lead to psychological damage. Option A. The child assesses the father's ambient anger, decides not to poke the bear, and chooses absolute silence. They just keep their head down and eat.
Which is a logical survival strategy on its face, right?
Yeah.
Minimal interaction reduces the surface area for conflict.
But if they execute option A, they're effectively abandoning the mother.
Yes.
They're leaving her entirely isolated on an island as she desperately tries to keep this conversational balloon in the air. So the child internalizes a crushing sense of guilt for failing to assist her, for letting her basically drown in the father's silence.
Exactly. Guilt becomes the emotional consequence of self-preservation. Now trace the mechanics of the alternative.
Option B. The child decides to absorb the mother's distress and joins her in the artificial cheerfulness. They try to laugh, they engage in the small talk, they help carry that emotional labor.
They become an active participant.
Right. But the moment they do this, they are acutely aware of the father sitting there, silently seething. The child's internal monologue becomes this state of terror, assuming the father is thinking, look at the two of you, carelessly enjoying yourselves while I bear the crushing weight of providing for this family.
They're exposing themselves to danger.
Yeah, they are painting a massive target on their own back, risking the father's sudden explosive rage.
And this is the architectural brilliance, well, the tragic brilliance of Bateson's double bind.
It's a trap.
It is. It is not simply a difficult choice between two bad options. It is a situation where the individual is confronted with two irreconcilable demands. And the structure of this system dictates that no matter which path they choose, they fail. And they are punished for that failure.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Precisely. Option A guarantees internalized guilt and the rupture of the maternal bond. Option B guarantees acute terror and the potential for paternal aggression.
And they can't exactly point out how messed up it all is.
No, furthermore, the child is not permitted to comment on the impossibility of the situation. They cannot say, this dynamic is unfair. They are trapped in a no-win psychological cage.
When a child's nervous system is subjected to that specific, inescapable cage day after day, the concept of the living room as a shelter is entirely annihilated.
Completely. The environment ceases to be a space of recovery and becomes a space of chronic, high-alert somatic monitoring.
So, practically speaking, how does a human being operate in a space like that? I mean, they don't really live, do they? They engage in tactical survival.
Tactical survival is exactly what it is.
The text explains that the living room transforms into a stage where the child is constantly running threat assessment algorithms.
Like a soldier in hostile territory.
Yeah. They become hypervigilant, analyzing micro-expressions, mapping the acoustic properties of a closing door, checking the emotional temperature of the hallway before they even dare to step foot into the shared space.
They're essentially conducting constant reconnaissance in their own home.
The sources use a chilling phrase here. They say the child begins to treat the dinner table merely as a nutrient supply stop.
Which strips away all the familial connection.
Right. It's treated with the urgency of a Formula One pit stop. You sprint in, ingest the requisite calories as efficiently as humanly possible, execute whatever minimal conversational script is required to avoid detonating in the room, and then immediately evacuate back to the bedroom.
Which, if we recall our earlier analysis, is already a dense environment of heavy rumination.
So they get no break.
None. The child has lost the crucial release valve. They are oscillating entirely between the pressure cooker of their own internal development in the bedroom and the active minefield of interpersonal conflict in the living room. The biological system has zero downtime.
And that lack of downtime forces a systemic behavioral shift, which kind of moves our deep dive from the internal silent suffering of the child into the very loud external consequences.
Because it always spills over eventually.
Exactly, because that magnitude of sustained psychological pressure doesn't just evaporate, it seeks an outlet. If the living room is structurally unsafe, the child's biological drive for attachment and safety doesn't disappear. It simply redirects its coordinates outside the home.
Right. Human beings, particularly adolescents, are evolutionarily wired to seek a secure base of operations. It is a biological imperative.
And they need a tribe.
Yes. And if that secure base is not provided by the familial infrastructure, the drive redirects toward any available surrogate.
And the clinical sources map exactly where that redirection leads. The child frequently bonds with what society basically labels as bad friends or delinquent peer groups.
The stereotypical troubled youth crowd.
Right, but the text frames this not as a moral failing, but as a deeply empathetic survival response. These aren't just random chaotic influences. These peer groups are often comprised of individuals who share the exact same profound domestic loneliness and internal tension.
They recognize the shared trauma in one another.
They do. They form a surrogate family system based on mutual unspoken pain, and this is the direct precursor to acting out delinquency, vandalism, shoplifting, or stealing from their own parents.
The external delinquency is merely a symptom. It is the externalization of the internal collapse of the home's emotional infrastructure.
Right.
And this mechanism gives rise to one of the most misunderstood and tragic archetypes in developmental psychology.
Which is?
The phenomenon of the good kid.
Ah, the good kid. We need to spend significant time analyzing this because it is so counterintuitive to how we typically assess child behavior.
It really throws a wrench in common sense parenting metrics.
The child we just visualized, the one sitting quietly at the tense dinner table, eating their food, keeping their head down, retreating to their room from the outside, they look like the ideal compliant child.
They seem perfect.
Right. They have become an absolute virtuoso at surviving the double bind by making themselves small and agreeable.
They have systematically suppressed their own developmental needs, their own voice, and their own emotional reality in order to successfully manage the volatile emotions of their parents.
And because they're so successful at this suppression, when the internal pressure finally ruptures into external delinquency, like when the local police call the parents about a shoplifting incident or the school reports sudden severe truancy, the parents are genuinely, profoundly baffled.
They are completely blindsided.
They experience true cognitive dissonance. They look at the authorities and say, "We have no idea where this is coming from. He is such a good, quiet kid at home."
It is a catastrophic misinterpretation of data.
Because they're looking at the wrong data point.
Exactly. The parents have mistaken the child's acute trauma response, specifically the fawning or freeze response of the autonomic nervous system, for actual holistic well-being. They viewed compliance as peace.
Wow. And when this misinterpretation collides with the reality of the child's acting out, the sources describe a final, devastating architectural transformation of the living room.
The final blow to the ecosystem.
It ceases to be a tense dining area and officially becomes an interrogation room.
This marks the terminal failure of the therapeutic alliance within the family system.
So the parents drag the child into the living room, sit them on the sofa, and shine a metaphorical spotlight in their eyes. They demand full confessions. They demand immediate apologies.
It becomes highly adversarial.
Yeah, they ask these aggressive, centering questions like, "Why are you doing this to us after everything we provide for you?" And the clinical text states that this specific dynamic, prosecuting the child in the space that was supposed to be their sanctuary, completely incinerates whatever fragile residual bond existed between parent and child.
The tragedy of the interrogation room is that the child's external misbehavior was, at its core, a desperate, poorly coded cry for intervention.
It was a distress flare.
Right. It was a signal that the internal pressure had exceeded structural limits. And instead of the parents reading the signal and offering a stabilizing intervention, they put the child on trial.
Which confirms everything the kid already feared.
Exactly. They validate the child's deepest, darkest cognitive distortion. That the parents are fundamentally unsafe. And that the child's pain is merely an inconvenience to the family's image.
As I read through this section of the research, I found myself wrestling with two competing reactions.
Well, like what?
Well, on one hand, it is incredibly devastating that a child's cry for help results in punishment. But simultaneously, looking at it purely from the parent's perspective, it is terrifyingly easy to see how they missed the plot.
It is. It really is.
If the child is an expert at the fawning response, if they are intentionally acting perfectly fine at home to avoid triggering the father, how are the parents supposed to penetrate that armor? They aren't clinical psychologists. They can't read the child's mind. What specific metrics were they supposed to be tracking?
This requires us to fundamentally redefine the utility of the living room.
Okay. How so?
We must view it not merely as a physical location for furniture, but as an informational processing space. The critical insight here is that the living room is primarily a theater for nonverbal ambient data sharing.
Nonverbal data sharing, meaning we are looking for things that are explicitly not spoken.
Correct. Children, and even older adolescents, rarely possess the sophisticated emotional vocabulary or the metacognition required to walk into a room and articulate their systemic distress.
Yeah, they cannot just say, "Mother, the daily double bind you and father create at the dinner table is causing a severe dysregulation of my nervous system, which is manifesting as a compulsion to shoplift."
Obviously not. They don't have a diagnostic manual in their back pocket.
Right.
Therefore, the diagnostic indicators of their distress will never look like a textbook presentation of clinical depression. They will not necessarily be weeping uncontrollably or refusing to leave their bed.
So what does it look like?
The signals are embedded in the microfluctuations of their daily routines and their somatic presentation.
And the sources highlight a highly specific behavioral concept here that I found deeply unsettling once I understood it. The Japanese term in the clinical text is karagenki, which translates roughly to fake cheerfulness or empty energy.
It is a highly sophisticated masking behavior designed to deflect parental scrutiny.
The text gives a microscopic example of how this manifests in the living room. It describes a child going through their normal morning routine, heading out the front door for school. Usually they toss over their shoulder, "Well, I'm off."
Just a standard farewell.
Right. But on this particular day, the timing of the phrase is off by half a second, or the pitch of their voice is modulated to be just slightly too bright, a little too
A
forced.
tiny aberration.
Yeah, and to a trained observer, that forced brightness secretly carries the heavy, despairing nuance of a permanent goodbye. It is an almost imperceptible leak of internal despair.
And here is where the environmental architecture of the living room becomes critical again.
Because you have to be able to hear it.
Yes. Building on that concept of microsignals, we have to ask, what environmental conditions are required to detect a signal that faints? It requires an exceptionally stable, quiet baseline.
You don't mean literal silence, though, right?
No, I don't mean literal silence. I mean a baseline devoid of ambient emotional chaos.
Ah, the sonar analogy.
Exactly the right framework. Think of a submarine operator listening for a tiny, distant anomaly on the sonar.
Right.
If the submarine itself is clanging, the alarms are blaring and the crew is shouting, the operator is totally deaf to the outside ocean.
That makes perfect sense.
If the living room is already a chaotic environment, if the father is radiating cortisol from his workday, and the mother's entire cognitive bandwidth is consumed by frantically managing his mood, the parent's diagnostic instruments are jammed.
There's too much interference.
In a noisy, tense, emotional environment, the child's tiny nonverbal SOS signals, their slight hesitations, their kergenki, are entirely invisible. You can only hear a whisper if the room is fundamentally at peace.
That fundamentally shifts the responsibility back to the environment. If you are constantly blasting the heavy metal music of your own unmanaged adult stress into the living room, you cannot be surprised when you fail to hear the smoke alarm going off in your child's head.
Precisely. And the devastating irony of the system is that when the child's behavior finally escalates in volume to a level the parents can detect, like the police knocking on the door,
Right.
the parents react with betrayed anger, completely unaware that they have been functionally deaf to months or even years of whispers.
Wow. We've spent a lot of time analyzing the psychological weight of this environment, the cognitive traps, the emotional masking. But the sources we are deep diving into today take a hard empirical pivot here that completely elevates the stakes.
We shift from psychology to biology.
Exactly. The tension we've been describing, this hypervigilant survival mode, does not just alter the child's mind or their behavior, it physically, biologically alters the architecture of their developing body.
In Western medicine, we have a long, unhelpful tradition of treating mental health and physical health as two completely separate jurisdictions.
Like they're different zip codes.
Exactly. But the human body does not recognize that boundary. The bridge between the psychological experience of a room and the biological function of the organs is the autonomic nervous system.
Let's get into the hard biology of the dinner table, because the sources draw a direct, undeniable line between the emotional climate of the living room and the function of the child's digestive system.
To understand this mechanism, we have to look at how the autonomic nervous system regulates homeostasis. It operates via two primary branches: the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system.
Right, and in basic biology classes, we often hear these described simply as the brake and the gas pedal of the body.
A decent shorthand, but we need to go deeper.
Right, given the depth of our sources, we need to go much deeper into the actual endocrinology of what's happening.
Let's map the pathways. When a child is in a fundamentally safe environment, when they perceive no physical or emotional threats in the living room, the parasympathetic nervous system is the dominant operator.
Which is clinically referred to as the rest and digest state.
Yes. The vagus nerve, which wanders from the brainstem all the way down through the abdomen, signals the body to divert massive amounts of energy and blood flow towards cellular maintenance, growth, and specifically the gastrointestinal tract.
And the sources detail the exact physiological cascade of this safety. When the child feels secure, salivary glands open up, producing the enzymes necessary to break down food.
The first step of digestion.
Right. The stomach secretes optimal levels of gastric acid. And crucially, the system activates peristalsis, the smooth, rhythmic muscle contractions of the intestines that physically push the food through the digestive tract, allowing for maximum nutrient absorption.
The body literally opens its doors to receive sustenance because the brain has declared the perimeter safe.
But now, introduce the toxic living room scenario we discussed earlier. The child sits down to dinner, the parents use the captive audience at the table to initiate a scolding session, or they use the mealtime as a venue to aggressively vent about their corporate grievances.
Or there's just the silent, seething resentment of an unresolved marital dispute hanging in the air.
The child's sensory organs detect this ambient hostility.
And the moment that hostility is perceived, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, fires.
It sets off the alarm.
It immediately hands control over to the sympathetic nervous system. The fight-or-flight protocol is initiated.
And the biological transition is instantaneous and violent. The hypothalamus signals the adrenal glands to flood the bloodstream with adrenaline and cortisol.
And here is where the biology intersects with the dinner plate. From a purely evolutionary survival standpoint, digesting a meal is a massive waste of metabolic energy if you are about to be eaten by a predator.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because your body doesn't know the difference between a charging tiger and a furious father at the head of the table. A threat is a threat.
Exactly. The body responds the same way. Therefore, the sympathetic nervous system initiates a process called vasoconstriction in the splanchnic circulation, the blood vessels supplying the gut. It literally pulls the blood supply away from the stomach and intestines, redirecting it to the skeletal muscles, the heart, and the lungs, preparing the child to either fight for their life or run away.
This is the mechanism that absolutely stopped me in my tracks. When you understand this biology, you realize that a tense living room literally paralyzes the digestive tract.
It brings it to a dead stop.
It halts peristalsis. The stomach stops producing acid, saliva dries up. The biological machinery of digestion is forcefully shut down.
Which manifests clinically as chronic indigestion, unexplained loss of appetite, persistent stomach aches, and over time, poor physical growth and developmental delays.
So think about this. You could spend a fortune at the grocery store. You could serve the most nutritionally dense, perfectly balanced organic meal ever prepared. But if you are delivering a harsh lecture while the child attempts to chew it, or if you are radiating anger across the table,
You are wasting your time and money.
you are forcing their body to physically reject the nutrients. The biological doors are locked.
The caloric and nutritional value of the meal is rendered entirely moot if the biological infrastructure required to process it has been dismantled by ambient stress.
Which means the atmosphere of the room is not just a pleasant backdrop, it is literally a biological ingredient in the meal.
That's a profound way to look at it.
The sources state that, conversely, a joyful, relaxed dinner table maximizes digestion, significantly reduces picky eating, and builds a robust, resilient physical body.
It initiates a profoundly positive biofeedback loop.
How does that loop work?
When the living room is a site of safety, the parasympathetic nervous system thrives. The child digests their food optimally, which leads to better nutrient absorption, which supports the healthy development of the enteric nervous system, the second brain in the gut.
Right, the gut-brain connection.
Yes. This healthy gut microbiome produces serotonin, which stabilizes their mood, leading to deeper, more restorative sleep, which in turn reinforces their neurological resilience against external stress the next day. By securing the emotional climate of the room, you are actively engineering a stronger physiological specimen.
So we have thoroughly established the catastrophic stakes. We've mapped the psychological landmines of the double bind, and we've traced the biological pathways of cortisol shutting down the gut. We know exactly what failure looks like.
Yes, the picture is pretty grim so far.
The inevitable urgent question that arises from the sources is, how do we actually construct a successful environment? If cortisol is literally stopping a child's digestion because of the room's dynamics, the physical and emotional geometry of the living room becomes a preventative medical issue. How do we change the geometry?
This is where our sources transition from clinical pathology to environmental architecture and actionable spatial design.
Finally, some solutions.
Yes. We must intentionally engineer the space to bypass the sympathetic nervous system and continuously signal safety to the parasympathetic nervous system.
And the foundational blueprint for this, according to the texts, revolves around a concept that challenges almost everything we assume about quality family time.
It really flips the script.
It is the concept of parallel activity. In the Japanese clinical literature, it is referred to as dukyateki ikdu.
It is the architectural antidote to the interrogation room.
Let's break down the mechanics of parallel activity. Because when society pictures the ideal family living room, we usually default to a forced, highly concentrated engagement.
Right, the Norman Rockwell painting.
Yeah. We picture everyone sitting in a tight circle on the couch, intensely focused on a single board game, making unbroken eye contact and demanding constant interaction from one another.
And while that type of concentrated engagement has its occasional place as a daily baseline, it is neurologically exhausting.
It's just too much pressure.
It requires constant performance and monitoring. True parallel activity, which provides optimal psychological safety, is structurally much looser. It is the condition of being in the same shared physical space, but engaged in entirely independent, decoupled activities.
The sources provide a highly specific visual framework for this. Picture the living room. The father is sitting in an armchair, watching a television program and occasionally chuckling to himself. The mother is seated at the dining table, focused on repairing some clothing or organizing paperwork, appearing relaxed.
And the children?
The children are spread out on a rug or a tatami mat, entirely absorbed in their own toys or reading a book. They are coexisting in the same atmospheric container, but they are completely separate in their focus.
This specific arrangement represents the pinnacle of environmental psychological safety. Consider the neurological lack of demand in this room.
There is no forced interaction.
None. No one is requiring the child to perform, to answer questions, or to manage adult emotions. Yet, and this is the critical therapeutic element, the child implicitly knows that if they require connection, the infrastructure is immediately available.
They know they can look up from their toys, voice a minor complaint, ask for a glass of water, or simply wander over to an armchair and lean against a parent's leg, and they will receive a warm, frictionless, immediate response.
The parents are entirely available, but fundamentally non-intrusive. It is proximity without demand.
And this spatial arrangement leads directly into another fascinating environmental variable the text examines. We've talked about the sightlines and the activities, but we also have to talk about the acoustics.
The power of noise.
The power of noise. This section blew up another major cultural stereotype for me, because we typically equate the ultimate ideal of a home with absolute peace and quiet. We strive for a silent house.
From an evolutionary psychology standpoint, a demand for absolute unbroken silence in a living space is deeply counterproductive to the nervous system.
Really, why is that?
If we look back at our ancestral development in the natural world, complete silence in an ecosystem rarely indicates peace. It almost universally indicates the presence of an apex predator.
Oh, right.
When the jungle goes completely silent, it means every organism is hiding, embracing for an attack.
And our neurobiology hasn't updated its software since then. When we walk into a completely silent house, our ancient survival circuits boot up. We don't think, how relaxing. Our nervous system thinks, who is furious? What are we hiding from? Where is the threat?
Precisely. The sudden absence of noise is a biological alarm bell. Therefore, the clinical text argues that moderate, ambient living noise is a crucial architectural feature of a safe home. It provides a constant, low-level acoustic signal of safety.
It's the sonar ping we talked about earlier, but inverted.
Yes, exactly.
Instead of masking a threat, it confirms the safety of the hull. The muffled sound of a parent chopping vegetables in the kitchen, the distant rhythmic hum of a washing machine, the low murmur of siblings talking in another room, the ambient noise of a television.
These specific acoustic frequencies communicate a profound message to the primitive layers of the child's brain. The noise says, the tribe is awake. The tribe is functioning normally. The perimeter is secure. You do not need to assume guard duty. You may lower your defenses and rest.
It provides a primal, undeniable sense of belonging to a protected group. And the clinical sources draw a massive lifelong conclusion from this specific feeling of ambient safety.
They make a huge leap here, but it's well supported.
They argue that this fundamental, deeply internalized belief, this physical sensation of I am unconditionally accepted and protected wherever I go in this house, serves as the exact template the child will use to interact with the external world as an adult.
Because the home is the simulator for external reality.
Right.
If the child learns, on a cellular level, that their microenvironment is secure and forgiving, they project that expectation onto the macroenvironment of society, the workplace, and future relationships.
It aggressively neutralizes their fear of the outside world. The text notes that this solid psychological foundation is the primary preventative measure against severe social withdrawal, such as hikikomori.
It fosters a highly resilient, active, exploratory adult.
They are brave enough to take risks and explore the unknown because their nervous system inherently trusts that their base camp is secure.
They can stretch the tether because they know the anchor point is immovable.
So, bridging the gap between psychology and interior design, how do we physically arrange our living rooms to encourage this parallel activity and generate this safe ambient noise? The sources offer highly specific architectural interventions. Space dictates behavior, so we have to engineer the space.
The physical environment must lower the psychological barrier to entry.
One of the most fascinating architectural concepts introduced is the necessity of a nook.
Yes, the nook is brilliant.
The text suggests designing or arranging a small, slight offset from the main room, perhaps a 2 to 3 tatami mat space, an alcove, or a designated corner with a comfortable chair that is visually connected to the room but slightly removed from the central axis.
Functionally, a nook serves as a psychological airlock.
A psychological airlock. I love that description.
It allows an adolescent, who might be feeling sullen, overwhelmed, or highly protective of their boundaries, to physically enter the living room and absorb that comforting ambient living noise without feeling like they have stepped onto center stage.
They don't have to be the star of the show.
Exactly. They do not have to immediately commit to the central family dynamic. They can exist on the periphery, marinating in the warmth of the room without the demand of participation.
It lowers the toll for entering the space.
Yeah,
The sources also explicitly warn against tall, isolating furniture.
yes, that's a big mistake people make.
If you chop up the living room with massive high-backed sofas or towering bookshelves that block lines of sight, you are creating physical silos. The recommendation is to utilize low-profile furniture to ensure unbroken sightlines across the entire space.
Unbroken sightlines facilitate the nonverbal data sharing we discussed
Not
earlier.
the pinging.
You can monitor the emotional temperature of the room and confirm the presence of your family members without having to physically move or initiate a conversation. It supports the feeling of a cohesive shared space, even when everyone is focused on separate tasks.
And perhaps the most vital behavioral rule attached to this architecture: if you want the child to utilize this carefully designed space, you must eliminate the interrogation tags.
This is where parents often fail, even with a great layout.
If a teenager wanders out of their bedroom and slumps onto the sofa to scroll through their phone, and the immediate parental reaction is a barrage of questions: who are you texting? Did you finish your math homework? Why are you slouching? What are you looking at? You have immediately reactivated their sympathetic nervous system.
You've initiated the fight-or-flight response.
You have turned the living room back into a hostile environment. If you pepper them with questions the moment they cross the threshold, they will simply stop crossing the threshold.
The space must be perceived as a neutral zone.
Which perfectly encapsulates the ultimate clinical and spatial goal described in the conclusion of our sources: the concept of lingering warmth.
This is the definitive metric for the success of the emotional architecture of a home.
The text paints a beautifully understated picture of what this looks like in practice. Imagine it is late at night. The structured activities of the day dinner, homework, chores are entirely complete.
The house is winding down.
Exactly. Perhaps one parent has just taken a bath and is sitting at the dining table in the dim light, quietly answering a few final emails. The living room is quiet, but it retains this ambient, lingering warmth. In this specific environment, the adolescent should feel entirely comfortable wandering out of the heavy rumination of their bedroom, walking into the living room and just asking, "What are you doing?" without needing a functional reason to be there.
And the critical variable is the parent's response.
Yeah.
The parent does not demand justification for the child's presence.
They don't scold them.
Right. They do not say, "It is past midnight. Why are you out of bed? Go back to sleep." The parent simply offers unconditional, warm acknowledgement. "Just finishing up some work. What's up?"
The child doesn't have to earn their right to exist in the living room by being entertaining, productive, or conversational. Just sharing the oxygen in the same space is recognized as inherently valuable.
When a human being feels, on a neurobiological level, that their mere presence is unconditionally accepted within their environment, their psychological infrastructure is complete.
They have what they need.
They possess the internal architecture required to withstand the complexities of the world.
This entire exploration completely reframes how I will look at the layout of a home moving forward. Let me attempt to synthesize this massive journey we've taken through these sources for you, the listener.
It's been quite a journey.
We started by looking at a completely ordinary arrangement of a couch, a coffee table, and a TV. But what the developmental psychology, the family systems theory, and the environmental architecture have shown us is that the living room isn't just a physical location. It is a highly active biological and psychological infrastructure.
This is an ecosystem.
We've learned that a child's bedroom is a dense, necessary laboratory for processing their identity and their family's complexities. But because that cognitive load is so heavy, the living room must act as the unconditional release valve.
It has to be the shelter.
If that shared space is instead infected with ambient adult stress, double binds, and forced interrogations, the child has nowhere to decompress. Their nervous system becomes trapped in a perpetual state of hypervigilance, redirecting their attachment needs toward delinquent surrogate families.
And flooding their bodies with cortisol.
Literally shutting down their gastrointestinal tract and stunting their physical development.
Conversely, by intentionally stripping away our own adult stress before crossing the threshold, by replacing interrogations with non-judgmental observation, and by architecturally supporting the beautiful mechanics of parallel activity and ambient living noise, We construct the exact biological and emotional foundation a human being needs to thrive.
It all comes down to engineering a space that constantly, passively communicates unconditional safety to the nervous system.
It's powerful stuff.
So I want to connect this vast clinical data directly back to your everyday life. Whether you're currently raising children, whether you live with a romantic partner, or whether you just share an apartment with roommates, take a hard look at the nonverbal ecology you are actively curating in your shared spaces.
Ask yourself the hard questions.
Are you inadvertently setting up Bateson's double binds when conflicts arise? Are you demanding forced, exhausting interactions? Or are you designing a spatial and emotional environment where someone can just sit in a nook, be entirely quiet, and feel their parasympathetic nervous system deeply relax because they know they're completely safe with you?
It is a profound responsibility, understanding the invisible forces we wield over one another's biology through the environments we create. And tracing this logic from childhood development into adulthood raises a deeply provocative question, something for you to analyze long after our deep dive concludes today.
Where does this lead us?
If we accept the clinical premise that the ambient noise, the sight lines, the spatial layout, and the underlying emotional tension of our childhood living rooms fundamentally programmed our autonomic nervous systems to default to either survival or safety,
Okay, I see where this is going.
we must apply that same architectural analysis to our current lives. How much is the physical layout of your adult workplace secretly triggering those exact same childhood fight-or-flight circuits today?
Oh, wow.
Consider the modern open-plan office desk with zero physical boundaries or psychological airlocks. Consider the dead, tense silence of the corporate break room, or the visually intimidating closed doors of management that block your sightlines.
That is unsettling.
Are you sitting at your desk right now, experiencing the exact same flush of cortisol and the exact same digestive paralysis that you felt at a tense, unpredictable childhood dinner table?
That is a staggering realization. We might just be endlessly mapping our unresolved living room survival tactics onto our office floor plans.
The architecture of trauma doesn't disappear. It just gets a corporate redesign.
That is a brilliant and genuinely unsettling framework to leave you with today. Thank you so much for joining us on this extensive deep dive. I highly encourage you to walk through your own living room, your kitchen, or your office tomorrow with fresh, clinical eyes.
Look past the furniture.
Notice the sight lines, notice the acoustics, notice the invisible, nonverbal forces bouncing off the walls.
The conditioning matrix is always operating once you possess the vocabulary to see it.
It changes everything. Until next time, keep exploring the hidden structures of your life, keep questioning the environment around you, and maybe, go turn on a little ambient, comforting noise in your house today. Take care, everyone.